There are moments in your life that act as doorways. You stand on the threshold, one foot in the world you have always known, and the other stepping into a room you never knew existed. And the air itself seems to change, to thin or thicken with the weight of what is about to happen. You can't always see the door as you approach it. Often it is disguised as an ordinary Tuesday, a simple conversation, a quiet evening at home. For me, that door looked exactly like Leo, standing in the middle of my living room, wearing my favorite gray sweater. It was a moment so mundane it should have been invisible, yet it became the hinge upon which my entire world swung open, revealing a landscape of terror and hope I had spent years pretending wasn't there. I had found him like that after returning from a late afternoon shoot, my camera bag a familiar weight on my shoulder, and the scent of city rain still clinging to my jacket. The key turned in the lock with its usual click, a sound that had always signified a return to solitude, to the quiet sanctuary of my own space. But that day, the silence was different. It was occupied. A soft light bled from the living room, the warm, yellow glow of the standing lamp I kept by the bookshelf. I remember the slight tremor in my hands as I set my bag down, the way my heart began a low, anxious drumming against my ribs. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had his own key, a privilege born of 1,000 late nights and a friendship that had long ago blurred the lines of convenience. But he was usually at his own apartment across town, decompressing from whatever corporate battle he had fought that day. And then I saw him. He was standing with his back to me, looking at the framed photographs on the wall, the ones I rarely showed anyone else. They were my private work, the images that felt more like self-portraits than landscapes, a study of fog settling over a deserted coastline, the intricate geometry of a frost-covered window pane, a blurred shot of city lights that looked like a constellation of fallen stars. He was perfectly still, absorbed in a way that made me feel like an intruder in my own home. And he was wearing my sweater. It was not just any sweater. It was a soft, charcoal gray cashmere blend I had saved up for months to buy, the kind of garment that feels like a second skin. It was worn at the elbows and the cuffs were beginning to fray, a testament to how often I reached for its comfort. On my frame, it was loose, a cozy armor against the world. On Leo, it was different. His shoulders, broader and more defined from years of collegiate soccer and a disciplined gym routine, filled it out completely. The fabric stretched taut across his back, clinging in a way that was both achingly familiar and jarringly new. It looked less like borrowed clothing and more like it belonged to him, as if it had been tailored for his body, for his quiet melancholy. He must have heard me because he turned, his movements slow and unhurried. His face, usually a mask of easy confidence or focused intensity, was unguarded. There were faint shadows under his eyes, and his hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it 100 times. He offered me a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The space between us was filled with the low hum of the refrigerator and the gentle patter of rain against the window pane. I felt 1,000 questions rise in my throat, a frantic orchestra of inquiry and accusation. What are you doing here? Why are you wearing my clothes? But I couldn't voice any of them. My role in our friendship had always been that of the quiet observer, the anchor, the one who absorbed his chaos without adding any of my own. To demand an explanation felt like a violation of some unspoken contract we had written between us years ago. He broke the silence first, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the quiet in the room. He gestured vaguely at the sweater with one hand, a self-conscious little shrug. I was cold, he said, as if that were the simplest, most logical explanation in the world. He looked down at himself, at the gray fabric clinging to his chest, and then his eyes met mine again, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, defiance, maybe, or a strange sort of vulnerability. A ghost of his usual playful smirk touched his lips. They fit better on me anyway. And that was it. That was the key turning in a lock I didn't know existed. The words themselves were innocuous, a simple, teasing statement he had probably made without a second thought. But in the charged silence of my apartment, with the rain falling outside and the scent of his skin mingling with the familiar wool of my sweater, it felt like a confession. It felt like a claim. He wasn't just borrowing my clothes. He was occupying my space, inhabiting my life, and declaring, in his own oblique way, that he belonged there. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart, the ones designed to protect our friendship from the dangerous, tidal pull of my own feelings, began to crumble into dust. I didn't know it then, but we were standing on the precipice of everything, and all I could do was stare at the man wearing my sweater and feel the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of a long, slow fall. It hadn't always been this complicated, this fraught with unspoken meaning. Our friendship had begun in the clear, uncomplicated light of a university lecture hall, a space defined by tiered seating and the dry scent of old books. I was a quiet art history major, more comfortable behind the lens of my camera than in a crowd, cataloging the world in frames of light and shadow. Leo was a force of nature, a business major and the star of the soccer team, a man who moved through the world with an effortless grace that drew people to him like moths to a flame. We were an unlikely pairing, two celestial bodies from different galaxies whose orbits somehow, inexplicably, crossed. I spent most of my time observing, and he spent most of his time being observed. We met over a shared art elective, a class he was taking purely for the credit, and I was taking as a cornerstone of my degree. I remember watching him from across the room during the first lecture. He was restless, his leg bouncing with a nervous energy that seemed entirely at odds with the hushed reverence of the darkened hall. He looked utterly out of his element, a lion caged in a library. I, on the other hand, felt completely at home. The darkness, the focused beam of the projector illuminating a Caravaggio painting, the hushed voice of the professor, it was my native habitat. I was sketching the chiaroscuro of the painting in my notebook when a pen clattered to the floor and rolled under my chair. Leo leaned over, his whisper a low rumble. "Hey, can you grab that for me?" I did, and when I handed it back to him, our fingers brushed. It was a spark of static electricity on a dry day, insignificant and yet startling. He gave me a quick, dazzling smile of thanks, and for the rest of the lecture, I couldn't focus on the art at all. My entire awareness had collapsed into that single point of contact. Our friendship didn't blossom overnight. It was a slow, tentative process, built in the quiet moments between classes and during late-night study sessions in the campus library. I discovered that beneath his confident, athletic exterior, there was a surprising depth, a thoughtful curiosity about the world that his usual circle of friends didn't seem to nurture. He would ask me about my photography, his questions genuine and insightful. He didn't just want to know what I photographed. He wanted to know why. He wanted to understand how I saw the world, what it felt like to frame a moment and steal it from the relentless march of time. In return, I learned about the immense pressure he was under, the weight of his scholarship, the expectations of his family, the brutal physical and mental demands of his sport. I became the repository for the anxieties he couldn't show anyone else, the quiet harbor where his ship could drop anchor and be safe from the storm. My feelings for him were a slow-developing photograph, an image that emerged gradually in the chemical bath of our shared time together. At first, it was just a deep admiration, a fascination with his energy, his light. But it deepened into something more, something tender and terrifying. It was in the way my stomach would clench when he'd throw an arm around my shoulders in a casual, friendly gesture. It was in the way I'd find myself mapping the constellations of freckles on his arms when he was focused on a textbook. It was in the profound, aching loneliness I felt whenever he would talk about the girls he was dating, a loneliness I had to carefully conceal behind a mask of supportive friendship. I became an expert in emotional alchemy, transforming the raw, painful ore of love into the polished, acceptable gold of platonic affection. The friendship was too precious to risk. He was the sun, and I was a planet caught in his orbit. To change the nature of our relationship felt like it would risk sending me spinning off into the cold, empty darkness. So I built my fortress of silence and observation, content to love him from a safe distance, to be his friend, his confidant, his anchor. It was enough. I told myself it had to be. For years, it was. We graduated, and our lives diverged and converged in the way of all modern friendships. He went into the demanding world of consulting, a life of airports and hotels and high-stakes presentations. I pursued my photography, scraping by with freelance gigs, finding beauty in the quiet, overlooked corners of the city. We lived in the same sprawling metropolis, but our daily realities were worlds apart. Yet, our bond remained. He was the one I called when I sold my first print. I was the one he called from a lonely hotel room in a city whose name he could barely remember. Our friendship was a constant, a fixed point in the chaotic cartography of our 20s. He had a long-term girlfriend, Sarah, a smart, ambitious lawyer who was his perfect counterpart in so many ways. They were a power couple, their future seemingly mapped out and assured. I was genuinely happy for him, even as a small, selfish part of me withered a little more each time I saw them together. A perfect picture of a life I could never be a part of. I played my role well, the supportive best friend, the third wheel who knew when to make himself scarce. The fortress I had built around my heart was strong, its walls thick and its gates barred. The first crack in that fortress appeared about 6 months before the incident with the sweater. It was a hairline fracture, almost invisible, but it was there. Leo and Sarah broke up. It wasn't a sudden implosion, but a slow, grinding dissolution that had been coming for months. Their ambitions, once parallel, had begun to diverge, pulling them in opposite directions until the strain was too much to bear. Leo was devastated, not with the loud, dramatic grief of a tragic romance, but with the quiet, hollow ache of a future that had simply evaporated. He didn't talk about it much, not directly. Instead, the change manifested in other ways. His relentless energy began to fray at the edges. The confident smile became a little more forced. The light in his eyes seemed to dim. It was around that time that he started showing up at my apartment more frequently. My place was a small, quiet loft in a converted warehouse, a space I had curated as a reflection of myself. It was filled with books and plants and the soft, diffuse light that photographers dream of. It was my sanctuary, a world away from the gleaming, impersonal high-rise where he and Sarah had lived. At first, he would come over under a pretext, to drop off a book he thought I'd like, to use my faster internet connection, to escape the noise of his own building's construction. But soon, the pretenses fell away. He would just appear, often late at night, looking like a soldier returning from a war I couldn't see. He would sink into my worn leather armchair, the one I had found at a flea market, and a long, heavy sigh would escape him, as if he were releasing all the tension he had been holding in all day. I never pressed him to talk. I would simply make him a cup of tea, the way I always had, and put on some quiet music. We would sit in comfortable silence, the space between us filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of his pain. My apartment became his decompression chamber, the place where he could shed the armor he wore for the rest of the world. He was a consultant, a problem solver, a man paid to have all the answers. But in my living room, surrounded by my photographs and the quiet hum of my life, he was allowed to be lost. He was allowed to be broken. And I, the quiet observer, simply held the space for him, my heart aching with a mixture of sympathy for his pain and a terrible, selfish spark of hope. The fracture in my fortress was widening, and a faint, dangerous light was beginning to shine through. The architect of my own solitude was suddenly faced with a guest who showed no signs of leaving, and the careful blueprints of my emotional life were being redrawn before my very eyes. The shift was subtle at first, a gradual change in the atmospheric pressure of our friendship. It was less a single, seismic event and more a series of small, barely perceptible tremors that slowly altered the landscape between us. The catalyst was his breakup with Sarah, compounded by a project at work that was draining the very life out of him. Leo, who had always been a self-sufficient island of relentless forward momentum, was adrift. He was searching for an anchor, and he found one in the quiet harbor of my apartment, in the steady, undemanding nature of my presence. The line between friendship and dependency began to blur, and I stood on my side of it, watching the water rise, unsure whether to be terrified or thrilled. His visits became a ritual, a predictable rhythm in the unpredictable score of our lives. It started with dinners. He'd text me late in the afternoon, a simple message, "Order pizza?" My treat. He would arrive looking exhausted, his tie loosened, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder. He would drop his briefcase by the door as if shedding a physical weight and collapse onto my couch. We would eat straight from the box, sitting on the floor, the conversation sparse and easy. We talked about my latest photography project or a ridiculous email from his boss. We never talked about Sarah or the hollow look in his eyes that seemed to deepen with each passing week. It was a silent, mutual agreement to avoid the epicenter of his pain, to walk around its edges, acknowledging its existence without ever having to name it. Then came the nights he started falling asleep on the couch. It would happen without warning. In the middle of a movie or a quiet conversation, his breathing would deepen, his head would loll to the side, and he would be gone, surrendered to an exhaustion that was more than just physical. The first time it happened, I was paralyzed. I sat there for almost an hour, listening to the soft rhythm of his sleep, my own heart a frantic, unsteady counterpoint. The air felt thick with a strange intimacy. I was acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth radiating from his body, the scent of his cologne now faint and mixed with the simple, human scent of sleep. Eventually, I would carefully get up, retrieve the thick wool blanket from the end of my bed, and drape it over him. My fingers would sometimes brush against his arm or his hair, and the brief contact would feel like a jolt of electricity, a forbidden touch that sent a tremor through my entire body. I would retreat to my own room, leaving the door ajar, and lie awake for hours, listening to the sound of him breathing in my living room, a sound that was both a profound comfort and an exquisite form of torture. The couch soon became the guest room. "My back is killing me," he'd mumble one morning, feigning a groan as he stretched. "Mind if I crash in your spare room next time?" "Your couch is a medieval torture device," I agreed. Of course, my voice carefully neutral. The guest room was small, containing little more than a bed and a small desk I used for editing photos. But it was a significant escalation. He was no longer just a visitor in my living space. He was now sleeping down the hall. A new ritual began. He would stay over 2, sometimes 3 nights a week, always citing an early flight or a late meeting as the reason. He'd bring an overnight bag, but soon, he just started leaving a few things here. A toothbrush in the bathroom, a spare shirt in the guest room closet. My apartment was slowly, insidiously, becoming his second home. The most significant change was the erosion of physical distance. It happened on the couch, our shared territory of quiet evenings. What started as a respectable distance, with a cushion marking the boundary between us, gradually shrank. It began with an accidental touch, his hand brushing mine as we both reached for the remote. Neither of us pulled away immediately. Then, one night, while we were watching a tense thriller, he shifted closer, his thigh pressing against mine. It was a casual, unconscious movement, I told myself. It meant nothing. But my entire body was on high alert, every nerve ending firing at that single point of contact. The heat from his leg seemed to seep into my own, a warmth that spread through my veins like a slow-acting poison. I couldn't focus on the movie. My entire universe had shrunk to the few inches of fabric separating his skin from mine. The final boundary to fall was the one I had guarded most fiercely. One particularly grueling week, he came over looking utterly defeated. He hadn't slept in days, he said, his mind a relentless churn of spreadsheets and deadlines. We were watching some mindless comedy, and he leaned his head against my shoulder. "Just for a minute," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. So tired, my body went rigid. I wanted to pull away, to preserve the safe distance I had always maintained. But I also wanted, more than anything in the world, to stay exactly where I was. So I didn't move. I sat there, ramrod straight, my own breath caught in my chest, as the full weight of his head settled against me. His hair was soft against my neck, and I could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his pulse. It was the most intimate physical contact we had ever shared, and it was happening under the guise of exhaustion, of platonic comfort. It was both a blessing and a curse, a moment of profound closeness that was built on a foundation of plausible deniability. He needed comfort, and I was a convenient source. That was the story I told myself. It was a simpler, safer story than the one my heart was desperately trying to write. A story where this was not an accident, but a choice, a quiet admission of a need that went far beyond friendship. It was in this new landscape of blurred lines and ambiguous touches that the borrowing of clothes began. It started innocently enough. He had forgotten a clean shirt for a morning meeting and asked if he could borrow one of mine. My shirts were a little too tight on him across the shoulders, but he wore it anyway. Seeing him in my clothes was a strange, disorienting experience. It was like seeing a reflection of myself in a distorted mirror. It was an invasion of my identity, a strange merging of our two worlds. Then it was a pair of sweatpants to lounge in, a hoodie to wear on a quick run to the corner store. Each item of clothing was a small surrender, another piece of my life that I was handing over to him. And then came the gray sweater. Unlike the other items, he didn't ask for it. He just took it. He found it, I assume, in the laundry basket or draped over a chair, and he put it on. When I found him wearing it that rainy evening, it felt different from all the other times. The shirts and hoodies were functional, items borrowed out of necessity or convenience. But the sweater was comfort. It was my personal armor, my wearable sanctuary. For him to take it, to wrap himself in it without asking, felt like he was bypassing all the layers of my carefully constructed defenses and reaching for the core of me. It felt like he was seeking not just my clothes, but my comfort, my warmth, my very essence. His casual, teasing line, "They fit better on me anyway," hung in the air between us, a shimmering, dangerous thing. It was a joke, but it was also a statement of possession. He was claiming my space, my comfort, my sweater. And the most terrifying part was that, as I looked at him standing there, so perfectly and achingly at home, I realized a part of me had been waiting for him to do it all along. The ritual had reached its inevitable conclusion. The walls were down. He was inside, and I had no idea what to do next. The days that followed were a masterclass in tension. The air in the apartment grew thick with things unsaid, a humidity of feeling that clung to every surface. We continued our ritual of quiet evenings, but now a new current ran beneath the calm surface, a powerful, invisible force that pulled us closer while simultaneously threatening to tear everything apart. I felt like a cartographer trying to map a new and volatile coastline, where the land shifted with every tide. Leo wore the gray sweater again, and then again, as if it were now his. He never asked. He would just emerge from the guest room after a shower, wrapped in its soft wool, and the sight of it would send a fresh jolt through my system every single time. It was a constant, silent reminder of the line we were approaching, a line that was becoming less of a clear boundary and more of a hazy, shimmering mirage. Our proximity on the couch became the new normal. The space between us had been permanently erased. Now, when we watched a movie, his arm would be draped casually over the back of the couch, his fingers sometimes brushing against my shoulder. His leg would press against mine, a steady, warm presence that I began to crave with a desperate, secret intensity. I lived in a state of hyper-awareness, my senses dialed up to their highest frequency. I was conscious of every shift in his weight, every soft exhale, every subtle change in the rhythm of his breathing. My life had become a detailed study of the man beside me, a photograph I was examining with a magnifying glass, searching for meaning in every grain, every shadow. I was losing myself in the analysis, dissecting his every gesture for a hint of intention, a clue that what I was feeling was not just a one-sided delusion. Was this just the evolution of a deep friendship, a natural progression into a more familial intimacy? Or was it something else? My mind was a courtroom, with hope and fear as the opposing counsels, each presenting a compelling, contradictory case. Fear argued that I was projecting my own desires onto his actions. He was lonely and stressed, grieving a lost relationship. He was clinging to the nearest stable object, which happened to be me. My apartment was a sanctuary, and my presence was a comfort. It was a friendship of convenience, intensified by crisis. To see it as anything more was to risk not only my own heart, but the very foundation of the most important relationship in my life. Hope, on the other hand, presented its own evidence. It pointed to the way his eyes would sometimes linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking, a soft, searching expression on his face. It pointed to the way he initiated the physical contact, the way he seemed to gravitate towards me, as if pulled by an invisible string. It pointed to the sweater, an act that felt too proprietary, too intimate, to be merely platonic. Hope whispered that maybe, just maybe, the ground was shifting under his feet as well. The crossing came on a Tuesday night. It had been a particularly brutal day for both of us. I had spent hours in my darkroom trying to salvage a set of prints that were resisting every effort to come to life, the images refusing to resolve into the beauty I had envisioned. Leo had come home from a week-long business trip, a grueling marathon of meetings that had left him looking hollowed out and fragile. He arrived at my door with his suitcase, not even bothering to go to his own apartment first. He didn't say anything, Just walked in and let the suitcase drop to the floor with a heavy thud. He was already wearing the gray sweater, which I realized with a jolt he must have packed for his trip. He had taken a piece of my comfort, a piece of my home, with him. We didn't talk much that evening. Words felt inadequate, too brittle to hold the weight of our shared exhaustion. I made pasta, and we ate in near silence. Afterward, we settled onto the couch. It was raining again, a steady, lulling rhythm against the large warehouse windows. We didn't turn on the television. We just sat there, side by side, listening to the rain and the quiet hum of the city. The silence wasn't empty. It was dense, filled with a palpable energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Leo leaned his head on my shoulder, a gesture that had become familiar but had lost none of its heart-stopping power. This time, however, it felt different. It wasn't the heavy, boneless weight of sleep. He was awake. I could feel the tension in his body, the subtle tightness in his muscles. After a long time, he shifted, lifting his head. He turned to face me, his body angled towards mine. The space between us was now impossibly small. The dim light from the lamp cast his face in a dramatic play of light and shadow, just like one of the Caravaggio paintings from the class where we first met. His eyes, dark and deep, searched mine. I felt pinned by his gaze, unable to look away, unable to breathe. My heart was a trapped bird, beating its wings frantically against the cage of my ribs. This was it. This was the threshold. I could feel the doorknob, cold and solid, under my hand. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a raw whisper, barely audible above the sound of the rain. "Jules." I could only manage a nod, my throat too tight for words. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. The look on his face was one of profound, gut-wrenching vulnerability. It was the face of a man standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified of the fall, but more terrified of not jumping. "Would it be okay?" he began, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, crystalline thing. He wasn't assuming. He wasn't taking. He was asking. He was offering me a choice, giving me all the power in a situation where I had always felt I had none. He was opening the door and waiting to see if I would step through. And in that moment, all the fear, all the doubt, all the years of carefully guarded silence, they all just fell away. All that was left was the simple, undeniable truth that had been living in my heart for a decade. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. Instead, I closed the small distance between us. The first touch of our lips was hesitant, tentative, a question and an answer all in one. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was soft and searching, a quiet exploration of a territory we had both been afraid to chart. I could taste the faint salt of his exhaustion and the deeper, sweeter note of something that felt like relief. My hand came up to cup his jaw, my thumb stroking the rough stubble there, and he let out a soft, shaky breath against my lips, a sound of surrender. It felt like coming home. It felt like a photograph finally, perfectly, resolving in the dark. The image I had always known was there at last, emerging from the shadows, clear and true and beautiful. We had crossed the line, and the world on the other side was both terrifying and more wonderful than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. The aftermath was not the explosion of clarity I had hoped for, but a slow, creeping fog of uncertainty. The morning after the kiss was a landscape of awkward silences and averted gazes. The beautiful, honest intimacy of the night before had evaporated with the dawn, replaced by a brittle tension that made the air in the apartment feel thin and hard to breathe. Leo was a ghost of himself, moving through my space with a strange, careful detachment. He made coffee without meeting my eyes, his movements stiff and unnatural. The easy familiarity that had defined our cohabitation was gone, shattered into 1,000 sharp-edged pieces. He left before I had a chance to say anything meaningful. He mumbled something about an early meeting he had forgotten, grabbing his suitcase and practically fleeing the apartment. He didn't even take the gray sweater, which he had left draped over the back of the armchair. It sat there like a silent accusation, a physical reminder of a boundary crossed and a connection now terrifyingly frayed. The front door clicked shut behind him, and the silence he left in his wake was a deafening roar. I stood in the middle of my living room, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I had stepped through the door, and it had slammed shut behind me, leaving me alone in a room I didn't recognize. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. My texts to him were met with short, delayed responses that were devoid of any of his usual warmth. "Busy week," he wrote. "Talk soon." A phone call went straight to voicemail. The silence stretched from one day into 3, then a week. The new world we had glimpsed together had vanished, and I was left stranded in the ruins of the old one, haunted by the ghost of a kiss. The courtroom in my mind reopened, and this time, fear was the only counsel present. It presented a brutal, damning case. The kiss had been a mistake. It was a moment of weakness, a product of his grief and exhaustion. He had reached for comfort, and in his desperation, he had reached too far, crossing a line he now profoundly regretted. He was running not because he was scared of his feelings, but because he had no feelings to be scared of. He was simply embarrassed, and he was trying to figure out how to salvage our friendship without having to face the awkwardness of his misstep. My hope, once so bright, had been extinguished, leaving behind the bitter ash of humiliation. I had built a cathedral of meaning out of a single, impulsive act, and now I had to live with the shame of my own foolish, wishful thinking. The gray sweater became a symbol of my folly. I couldn't bring myself to wear it, but I couldn't put it away either. It remained on the armchair, a slumped, inanimate effigy of him, of us. Every time I looked at it, I felt a fresh wave of anxiety and regret. The object that had once represented a blossoming, unspoken intimacy now felt like evidence of a crime of misinterpretation, of wanting too much. My sanctuary had become a prison, each familiar object a reminder of what I had lost. The quiet of my apartment, once a source of peace, was now a hollow, lonely ache. After a week of this agonizing silence, I knew I couldn't continue. The ambiguity was eating me alive, a slow-acting acid dissolving my insides. I had to know the truth, even if it was the truth I feared the most. I needed to hear him say it was a mistake so that I could begin the painful process of rebuilding the walls he had so carelessly, so briefly, dismantled. Clinging to a sliver of false hope was more painful than facing a devastating certainty. So, with a heart that felt like it was beating somewhere in my throat, I made a decision. I walked over to the armchair, picked up the gray sweater, folded it carefully, and put it in a tote bag. Then I grabbed my keys and walked out of my apartment, leaving my sanctuary behind to march into the heart of my own fear. His apartment building was one of those new, sterile towers of glass and steel that prided itself on its soulless minimalism. It was the complete antithesis of my own warm, lived-in space. As I stood in the elevator, ascending through the silent, numbered floors, I rehearsed what I would say. I would be calm, rational. I would give him an easy way out. "Hey, no big deal," I'd say. "Things got weird. Let's just forget it and go back to how things were." It was a lie, of course. We could never go back. But it felt like the right, kind thing to offer him, an escape hatch from my own messy feelings. He opened the door after the second knock. He looked worse than I had ever seen him. He was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was still in the clothes he had likely slept in. He stared at me, his expression a mixture of shock and something that looked like dread. "Jules," he breathed, his voice hoarse. "Can I come in?" I asked, my own voice steadier than I felt. He stepped back, letting me enter. His apartment was a mess. Takeout containers littered the kitchen counter, and clothes were strewn over the furniture. It looked like the home of someone who had given up. The man who curated his life with such precision was living in chaos. I turned to face him, holding the tote bag with the sweater in it. I didn't know where to begin. All my rehearsed speeches evaporated. "I just need you to be honest with me, Leo," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Whatever the truth is, I just need to hear it. If the other night was a mistake, if you were just lonely or confused, you can tell me. I can handle it. I can't live in this silence. It's killing me." He flinched as if my words were physical blows. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at a point on the floor somewhere between us, his jaw tight. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure, unadulterated distress. "It's not that simple," he muttered. "It feels pretty simple from where I'm standing," I said, a bitter edge creeping into my tone. "You kissed me, and then you disappeared. That feels like a pretty clear message." "No," he said, finally looking up at me, his eyes pleading. That's not it. It's not you. It's me. I'm so messed up, Jules. He sank onto his couch, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with a silent, racking sob. And in that moment, my anger and my hurt dissolved, replaced by the familiar, overwhelming urge to comfort him. I sat down next to him, not touching him, just closing the distance. I waited. After a minute, he took a deep, shuddering breath and began to speak, his voice muffled by his hands. I've spent my whole life on a track, he said. College, soccer, the right job, the right girlfriend. Everything was planned out. I knew what my life was supposed to look like, and it was all fine. But it was gray. It was like I was living in black and white. He dropped his hands and looked at me, his eyes raw with a pain that went deeper than his breakup. And then things started falling apart. Sarah, work, it was all crumbling. And the only place I felt anything was at your apartment. With you. It was the only place with any color. He paused, struggling to find the words. I didn't understand it. I still don't. When I'm with you, this quiet part of me I didn't even know existed just settles. And I started needing it. Needing to be near you. And it scared the hell out of me. He gestured vaguely around his chaotic apartment. So I ran. I came back here, to my real life, and tried to force it to make sense again. I tried to convince myself that what happened was just a weird fluke. But it's not working. Because this doesn't feel real anymore. You do. His confession hung in the air, as vulnerable and honest as his question had been on the night of the kiss. He was terrified. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself, from a truth so profound and life-altering that it threatened to shatter his entire understanding of who he was supposed to be. He had spent his life following a map, and he had just realized he was in a country he didn't recognize, speaking a language he didn't know. And he was utterly, completely lost. I reached into the tote bag and pulled out the gray sweater. I unfolded it and held it out to him. You forgot this, I said softly. He looked at the sweater, then at me, his eyes welling with tears. He didn't take it. Instead, he just looked at me, a silent question in his gaze. It was the same question he had asked on my couch, but this time it held a new weight, a new meaning. It wasn't just about a kiss anymore. It was about everything. And I, the quiet observer, the patient friend, the man who had loved him in silence for a decade, I knew my answer. I had always known. I just needed to be brave enough to say it out loud. The resolution wasn't a sudden, cinematic moment of perfect understanding. It was quieter than that, more fragile. It was a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding, not on the old foundation of our friendship, but on the new, uncertain ground of our confessed feelings. The conversation in his apartment was the first stone laid in that new construction. I didn't push him or demand labels. I simply listened. I sat with him in the chaos of his life and offered him the one thing I had always given him, a safe harbor. I told him that it was okay to be scared, that it was okay to be confused. I told him that he didn't have to have it all figured out right now. We just had to stop running from it, and from each other. We didn't go back to my apartment that day. We stayed at his. I helped him clean, a simple, domestic act that felt profound in its normalcy. We threw away old takeout containers, gathered laundry, and slowly, methodically, brought a semblance of order back to his space. It felt symbolic, as if we were clearing away the debris of his old life to make room for something new. We talked as we worked, not about the future or what this all meant, but about small things, my latest photo series, his ridiculous boss, a funny story from college. We were relearning how to be with each other, finding our footing on this new terrain. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, careful tenderness. That night, for the first time, we chose to share a bed. It wasn't out of convenience or exhaustion. It was a conscious decision. There was no pretext. Lying next to him in the dark, I felt a sense of peace that was so deep, so absolute. It almost felt like a dream. He turned to face me, and in the faint light filtering through the window, I could see the anxiety had finally receded from his face, replaced by a look of weary relief. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. It was a simple gesture, but it felt more binding than any contract, more intimate than any kiss. I'm sorry I ran, he whispered into the darkness. I know, I whispered back. Just don't do it again. I won't, he promised. And I believed him. The following weeks were a period of gentle realignment. Leo began the slow process of disentangling himself from the life he thought he was supposed to live. He started setting boundaries at work, pushing back against the demands that had been consuming him. He started talking about what he actually wanted, not what was expected of him. It was like watching a person come into focus, the blurred edges sharpening into a clear, defined image. And I was there, a quiet, constant presence, documenting the change not with my camera, but with my heart. He started staying at my apartment again, but it was different now. He wasn't a refugee seeking sanctuary. He was a man coming home. He moved his things in slowly, piece by piece, not with an overnight bag, but with boxes. His books started to appear on my shelves. His coffee mug became a permanent fixture on the counter next to mine. His clothes began to mingle with my own in the closet. My space became our space, the architecture of my solitude redesigned to accommodate two. The door to the guest room remained permanently closed. The rituals that had once been so fraught with ambiguity became sources of simple, uncomplicated joy. Cuddling on the couch was no longer a moment of agonizing analysis, but an act of mutual comfort and affection. His head on my shoulder was not a sign of exhaustion, but a declaration of trust. The physical space between us was no longer a territory to be navigated with caution, but a shared world we inhabited with ease. The plausible deniability was gone, replaced by a beautiful, honest certainty. One evening, a few months later, I came home to find him in the kitchen, making dinner. The apartment was filled with the warm, savory scent of garlic and herbs. He was wearing the gray sweater. It was so familiar now, so much a part of the fabric of our life together, that the sight of it no longer sent a jolt of anxiety through me. It just felt right. It looked like it belonged to him. Or rather, it belonged to us. I walked up behind him and wrapped my arms around his waist, resting my chin on his shoulder. He leaned back into my embrace, a comfortable, familiar weight. He turned his head slightly, and his lips brushed against my temple. "Hey you," he murmured. "Hey," I said, my voice soft. "That smells amazing." "It's almost ready," he said. We stood there for a long moment, swaying gently to the rhythm of some silent music, two parts of a whole that finally fit together. The journey had been long and frightening, a navigation through a fog of unspoken feelings and profound uncertainty. But we had found our way through it. We had weathered the storm and reached the calm waters of the harbor. Some homes, I've learned, are not built of wood and stone, but of shared silence and mutual understanding. They are not places you find on a map, but spaces you create with another person, a sanctuary built within the fortress of their arms. We had to dismantle the old structures of our friendship, with its carefully guarded walls and hidden rooms, to build this new home together. It was a place where there were no more secrets, no more unspoken fears, just the quiet, steady truth of two people who had found their way back to each other, not as friends, but as partners. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the profound and peaceful sound of love.